Van's here. He's just out there yapping.
Would you like to call roll?
Yes. Vice Chair Lovelace?
Here.
Committee members Wolf?
Here.
Hintermeister?
Here.
Hutchison?
Here.
Oliver?
Here.
Edgerton?
Oh. Thought you called me twice. Sorry. My hearing's a little bad.
All right, so we have a quorum and we have...
Does that mean I get to vote double if there's a vote?
So as far as the reports by the chair, I have nothing to report. I'll ask the committee if they have anything.
No.
Yeah?
No.
Okay, so nothing from the panel, so we'll go ahead and start with the executive officer's report.
We do have a public comment.
Oh, good. Awesome.
Doug Bearhead?
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, committee members, staff, guests. For the record, my name is Doug Muirhead. I live in Morgan Hill. I was reading an article. It was co-authored by Gally Basson of the OSA in Conservation Biology, which is all irrelevant, but in it they cited a statement from a paper by Toomey, Knight, and Barlow, which I thought was very interesting, and I'll tell you why after I repeat it for you. But the quote goes, "Conservation is a social process that engages science, not a scientific process that engages society." And I think that's important because I feel that too often we talk to people as if they were already within our tribe. And I just go a little bit crazy every time someone starts to talk, uses the words ecosystem services, valuation thereof. So I just found this particular statement in the ordering of society and science to be a helpful way to think about what we should think about when we're talking to other people. So I just wanted to pass that on. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Anyone have anything? No? Okay, cool. So, I guess we can approve the minutes for the last meeting. Anyone?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second. The minutes are approved.
Is that a unanimous vote?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I
Is
didn't.
that a unanimous vote?
Okay, so should we take a vote? We'll go down verbal from everyone, right?
Aye. Aye. Aye.
Unanimous vote? Okay. Let the record show that Julie has made it in for the meeting. Thank you, Julie.
All right. Oh, you're welcome.
Now we'll go on to committee reports. Right.
Oh, yes. So first up on the final revenue and expenses for fiscal year 18. So it takes a little while, a couple months before all the receipts come in, all the fees come in. We deal with all the expenses. And towards the end of September, we get an accurate assessment of where we stood with fees that were taken in, revenues that were taken in, and also what our costs were for fiscal year 18. There's a correction sheet that was handed to you, and the second page of that sheet, so the back side, you'll notice it's highlighted. Those numbers were mistakenly reported. I think they were reversed, where the serpentine fees were only $6,500 from the water district, and most of the fees that the water district paid for impacts, mitigation fees, were associated with aquatic impacts.
Okay.
And so that reflects the correction.
I also noticed that there was an addition in that section under Santa Clara Valley Water District in the column co-permittee, that there was the addition of, in the original it said land cover fee and serpentine fee and wetland mitigation fee was added.
Yes, correct.
And then the number 6,563 was also added to that column to represent the serpentine fees.
Correct.
Okay.
So I'll go over this a little bit. So when we came to you, I think it was last spring, and we were going over the projected budgets and where we thought our costs would be for the past fiscal year, and we were projecting what our budget would be for the next fiscal year. I think Jan brought up, well, that's a lot of money you're spending on administrative. And we took that to heart and sort of rethought about how staff, where their work allocation actually is. And on that first page, that sort of reflects, sort of the last paragraph on that first page of the memo reflects how each of us spend our time. So that's Tara and Jerry and myself. And we believe that more accurately depicts where our salaries should reflect the categories that the work is being done and not just putting it all in administrative. And I think, Jan, your issue was, and others agreed, that the optics of it didn't look good. So we've sort of re-examine the optics and say, okay, well, Jerry and Tara, most of their work are spent in technical and permitting and conservation action activities. And my time is a little more evenly split between the three categories. So we tracked our time over a couple months and got a sense that this is a more accurate distribution of how we spend our time, and they are now in the appropriate expense cost categories. And if you'll notice it's page 11, it's the third page of the staff report, but it's page 11 in your pamphlet, in your booklet. The fiscal year 17 actual reflects those. Actually, it should be the fiscal year 18. That's a mistake. But the fiscal year 17 actual reflects the reallocation of those administrative costs. So we had budgeted almost 1.2 million for administrative, but you can see the actual is actually 711,000.
Okay.
And that reflects sort of the feedback we got from the board. And going forward, that's how we're going to be tracking our salary expenses based on the actual work that's being done versus all salaries being in the administrative column, because a lot of the work we do isn't administrative. So as you can see, the revenues for the year, and that's reflective in the end of that first spreadsheet you see that carries over from pages 10 to 11, that our actual revenues were $10,358,385. So we had our best year by far in terms of revenues from fees, reimbursements from the LAG program, and interest income and so forth. So it doesn't reflect grants that we got for land acquisition. Those will be tracked in our books once we acquire a piece of land and use those funds to help acquire it. Our actual expenses for last fiscal year were $2,384,700, and we had projected it would be April of 2017, we projected that our budget would be 3.6 million, roughly 3.6 million, a little more than that. So the big reason why there's a $1.3 million roughly difference in expenses was the timing of the San Felipe construction project, which this year's budget will reflect that project being constructed and completed. We had thought it would have started last year, and it didn't because of permitting issues. So if you have any questions about this final calculations on our budget, I'm prepared to answer any questions you may have.
I have none. I'll open it up to the chair, to the board.
Edmonds, I just had a couple of questions. One, representing the business side of us, the public,
Yes.
it would be helpful for me to just have just a rough idea of the percentage of income that comes from public agencies versus public developers like myself.
Yes.
Just a percentage, just to get a feel for that. And then the second question I had is I noticed in the expenses that we're paying, I think, around $10,000 some odd dollars every month for legal counsel.
Correct.
At fixed amount. That sounds like a retainer fee.
Yes.
And I just wonder, is that something that you feel is the right way to do that? It seems like a lot of money unless we're really using the services, and if so, that's fine. But that's my recollection on a retainer fee, they charge you for the services afterwards anyway. So I'm not sure I understand, but maybe you could help us out.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if it's the best way to do it or not. What I inherited, but it's a good question. We can look into it. Valerie Armento, the attorney, she works, probably two to 3 days a week on issues related to the Habitat Agency. Whether that's a cheaper, whether we're getting good value or not, I don't know. But I can look into it. Yeah, it's a fair question. And we do know which is public and which is private. Yeah, we can get that information to you.
Thank you.
I can tell you that most of the stuff you see for San Jose is private. Most for Gilroy you see is private, if not all of it. There might be one small public project in Gilroy. Morgan Hill's a little bit more of a mix. The county is definitely more of a mix. And the Water District, of course, speaks for itself. Yeah.
I had a couple of questions, actually, now that you've mentioned that Gilroy is mainly private, you were saying, these
Yes,
land cover fees?
correct.
So I'm just wondering what the projects would be to have the nitrogen deposition fee so low then versus, I don't know, is it just, because I mean, I know there's a lot of housing going up in Gilroy, so I'm just wondering why it's so low then.
Yes, some of the housing, the fee's low.
Yeah, I know, yeah. I
Yeah.
know the nitrogen deposition
Yeah.
fee is the lowest. I mean,
Yes.
I remember a whole discussion around it and how
Yes.
it got brought down.
And we're going through a 5-year review process.
Yeah.
You guys heard, I think, Bob Spencer will be coming to update you on that process next year. And the fees will be looked at. Are we charging enough? Are we charging too much?
Yeah, it's just because if you look at the city of Morgan Hill, their land cover fee is like less than half of what Gilroy's is.
Yeah.
And we're talking about, private projects, and the nitrogen deposition fee is lower than Morgan Hill's. So I'm just trying
Yes.
to
Yeah.
set that right in my mind.
Yes, I'd have to go in and look at what the Morgan Hill projects were and why there's a differential. I know there were some Morgan Hill projects, all they did pay was the nitrogen. So that could account for some of it.
Okay.
There were several Morgan Hill projects that we thought were going to come in last fiscal year. They're now came in this fiscal year, this summer. And so that's one reason why there's the differential between the land cover fees between the two cities.
My question was just one of clarification on the next one, which was the California Habitat Conservation Fund partners. Are these fund partners paying for your salary to be lobby on their behalf? Like,
No,
I'm not clear
no,
on,
this,
because I read later the
yes.
lobbying activities,
Yes.
but I'm
Yeah,
not.
We're only managing the contract, yeah,
So they're, okay,
Yeah, so
All right.
we also contribute 5,000.
Okay.
And it's for environment and energy and environment consulting.
EEC?
Yeah,
Yeah,
EEC.
yeah, I
correct.
know who, yeah, I know who they are, yeah. Okay, all right, okay. So we're essentially just holding the,
Exactly. But YOLO is now paying Tara and Jerry and I to help consult with their startup issues. So we are making a small amount of money.
Okay.
And that's a new contract. So it's interesting you asked that question. So we are doing some side, well, it's revenue for the agency, but it is a side consulting gig to help them with some of the startup issues that they have.
okay, all right. And just back to your notes around Coyote Ridge Reserve Ponds restorations, just a question of curiosity. The reserve ponds, are they for red-legged frog and CTS? Or
Yes, correct.
just those two?
Yes.
Okay. That was all the questions I had, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a couple questions. So this report is really for us, it's information only. So which of the boards actually is responsible for approving this, or is there?
This
or
is
that
information
your
only for
discretion?
them, too.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's really, this is your report, it's at your
Right.
discretion,
Correct.
and all the boards just get
Yep.
updates.
So they approve the budget, and then we update them periodically on how it pencils out at the end. So we gave them an estimated actual back in June. We said, well, this is where we think we'll be once we close our books.
So in terms of anyone who actually kind of looks at this report in detail, it's like our accountant or
Yes,
um,
correct.
is really,
Yeah, yeah. So the auditor looks at our books, and the CPA helps with preparing the books. Yeah.
the other question I had was, so when the Habitat Plan document was originally produced, there was like some mammoth financial section, which I confess I did not look at very carefully.
Yeah.
So is that document totally water under the bridge now?
No.
Or do we kind of look at, our yearly expenses or trends or whatever and kind of validate the assumptions that were made in that? So how does all this financial reporting kind of relate back to the original document?
So this 5-year review that we're going through is going to update those numbers in that spreadsheet, and it's going to see if things that were being tracked are holding.
So if we want to look at like, kind of the expectations that have been made for administrative expenses, that's something that'll be kind of covered in that
Yes.
5-year review?
Correct, yes. And so far, we're about on pace with what the plan predicted. It was about $7 million in revenue per year from fees, and we're about on that pace right now. Last year was not a good year. This year was a much better year, so it's kind of averaged out.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking that too, just I saw that we had about 10 million in revenue. And we had like a 50-year plan and it was about 600 million?
650 million,
So that
and
was,
55% of that, 350 million or something like that, is from the fees that developers and private projects pay. Yeah.
okay, but again, we'll kind of get more insight into that as part of this 5-year.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So one of the things is restoration's expensive. Are we collecting enough
Yeah.
to pay for it?
Yeah. When is the first draft of that kind of 5-year?
They started working on it. They met with the TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee, and so they've started to work on it. It's supposed to be ready in the early spring, and we'll present it to you. We'll have the economists present it to you. Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks.
You're welcome.
Craig?
Ed, I noticed on the burrowing owl fee, ends up being about a little under 50% of the total fees. And yet, what I know on the burrowing owl work that's being done is the trapping and banding, which probably doesn't cost $4.6 million
No.
to do. So the question is, how is the remainder of that going to be used? Is that for land purchase, or is it actual for research into the owl? Because that's a lot to.
Yeah, so
research.
that's the money, so the way, when the people put the plan together, the way they envisioned it was that those owl fees were gonna be triggered very early on. So we were gonna get a lot of revenues up front, and then those revenues are supposed to sustain us for, you know, X number of decades. Because at some point, the area where the owls are is gonna be built out. So some of it is supposed to go for land acquisition for owls, but where the owls are, the land is super expensive. But a lot of it's going to go for Tier 3 activities, which is, we're going to be starting to do, and the owl people are here today to talk to you about this, but we're going to start doing a captive rearing program.
Right.
With the Humane
Didn't cost
Society.
4.6
Yeah, I don't want to
million
steal their
catch a bunch of
thunder.
owls.
Yeah, and, but we met, Jan was at the meeting with, for the open, he's on the Open Space Public Advisory Committee too, Open Space Authority. And we made a presentation to that group about doing, it's not really translocation, but taking the captively reared chicks, and I think 2020 or 2021, something like that, and trying to establish a population at the OSA Coyote Valley Preserve.
Right.
So there's the land management agreements that we have, and we want to do more of those. We're trying to get our foot in the door with the airport. We haven't had much luck to date. So that's how the money will be spent over time, too.
So this money will be kept in like a separate little pot and just be
Yeah.
taken until that's used up?
Yeah, I mean, some of it
Okay.
might be used, let's say we got a big land acquisition, we got, you know, that's a lot of money to have in one fund, so we may borrow from that fund to help acquire our property and then pay it back. But ultimately, all that money has to be spent on burrowing owls, yeah.
And it's likely not to increase much over the coming,
The plan envisioned about 8 million in fees, and we're already over around 6. But there's a lot of development that may or may not happen around the wastewater treatment plant and the dump. I don't know how that's all going to play out over time. So if there's a lot of development in that Zanker Road area, we'll collect a lot more burrowing owl fees if the owls are still there.
Okay.
Which we don't know. As the owl people will be showing you that the owl's not doing well. So that's why we're doing this captive rearing. The agencies aren't comfortable with captive breeding, but that's one of the things we're talking about, thinking of doing, is establishing a captive breeding program, which is what they're doing in British Columbia.
okay, thanks.
Sure.
Anyone else? Okay, Ed, I think we're good.
Okay.
Oh, great. I should remember our speakers.
Thank you again, Doug Muirhead, Morgan Hill. I have one specific question, then I have a couple of more general questions. And since they are designed to help me understand activities under some of these headings, they may not be something you want to talk about tonight, which won't hurt my feelings, but I won't know unless I ask. So the little detail question is under the accounts and funds associated with technical and permitting support.
Okay.
There's a line that says Linode or Linode, Linode HCP maps. What are they? That was a specific question.
Okay.
The next,
Under plan interpretation and implementation.
yeah.
Yeah, it's part of our licensing we have to do with our software.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yep.
All right.
Jill got really specific there, which is good. You had a question about it.
Yeah, and I learned something, and I can go away happy, which doesn't happen all that often. So under plan interpretation,
Yep.
I really would like to better understand some of these categories in terms of specific activities. And so,
Sure.
as an example, I would like to know some of the things you do under plan interpretation
Sure.
associated with lake and stream bed alteration agreements, for
Yeah.
example. I mean, especially water, where I'm also interested in the water
Yeah,
district.
yeah, I can tell you
So
about that. So it's a,
You might ask your committee if they want to spend time on this tonight, which
up
is.
to you guys. Okay, all
Okay.
right.
Well, great.
He was being very respectful. I was just ready to engage him in a one-on-one and forget about you
I
guys,
know.
so.
Well, I was up at FGOC there a little bit.
Very loose meeting tonight. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, the state has two programs. Most of us, so we're implementing a natural communities conservation plan through the state of Fish and Wildlife Agency. What frustrates a lot of us NCCP practitioners is that the state has never included their 1600 permit process kind of under the umbrella of the NCCP. So what we got here was a letter from them, a guide. So we wrote a guidance memo that they helped us write. That when a project comes in, they don't have to do double mitigation. So if Dick's doing a project and he needs a 1600 permit, and he's paying the habitat plan fees, and our fees cover all the actions that would be covered under a 1600. There's things that a 1600 might cover that we don't cover, and therefore they would have additional mitigation.
Okay.
But there were some projects that were happening where the applicant was paying our riparian stream bank fees, and then the state told them they had to plant trees in an area where they were allowed to take trees and put in an outfall structure. It was in the city of San Jose. So we got in a discussion with the state saying, if it's something covered by the habitat plan, a person shouldn't be having to mitigate for it twice, and they agreed. But there are things we don't cover, like we don't cover fish. Our plan is kind of gray on how we deal with geomorphology and hydrology. So there's certain things that the state may say, your project's doing X, Y, Z, so you do have to pay additional fees. Or if it's a rare plant, our plan doesn't cover, then they'd have to deal with that.
That's very helpful.
Oh, you're welcome, yeah. And the other memos there are plan interpretation issues.
Yeah, again, I
Yeah.
was trying to make plan interpretation something real that I
Yeah,
could understand.
yeah,
through-
and I can talk to you about those two if you.
Well, I was
yeah.
thinking, the next time you invite me on one of your
Sure.
field tours,
Sure.
I'll just bend somebody's ear.
Yeah, Tara, Jerry, or I.
Okay.
We're all.
So
Yep.
the other two things that I wanted to bring to your attention have to do with the category of technical and permitting, as the director said earlier. They did break it out. So I'm looking. You've got two principal planners. One spends 25%, another spends 55% on technical and permitting. So you've lost almost an entire person on that category. So how much of that is technical? How much of that is permitting? The water district ends up fighting with resource agencies because the two agencies give them conflicting requirements. So clearly you're going to chew up a person's time with that. So, I'd be a little more interested in, if these are very different kinds of activities, even break them out one part
Yeah.
farther.
Yes, those are, the title really doesn't describe very well what. So-
Okay.
So Jerry is the one at 55%, I believe, and he
Yeah, well,
implements.
he's number two, so,
Yeah, so he's the one that implements the regional general permit. He does all the participating special entity
Yeah, okay.
applications. So he does a lot of that.
okay.
He was involved in the stream bed memo.
Right.
Yeah, and Tara does some of that work too,
Right.
and I'm involved in it.
Yeah, I did
Yeah,
see that you
yeah.
took some of that too.
And we're also trying to get, to integrate, we're involved in creating an in lieu fee program through the Corps, and we're trying to integrate the NOAA Section 7 consultation for fish into our regional general permit. So a lot of it is creating complementary, streamlining permit integration processes to help people like Dick when they come in with a project. They don't have to go out. If things are more integrated, it makes it easier for them. So a lot of our time's spent in meetings,
Yeah, and that,
negotiating that with the water regulators.
yeah, and that's a nice lead into the second part of this question, and that is, you know, are you engaged in activities either with the resource agencies or with your partners to see if there's a way to reduce the permitting burden? And unfortunately, I can't find it, but a couple of months ago at the Water District, someone came in from some Bay Area regional organization, and they were talking about a framework where they would bring a number of agencies together and really try and come up with a way to make everybody happy with this, which, you know, in concept sounds really fine.
RCIS.
No, it's not RCS, and that's why I'm frustrated. I can't find the memo, but I'll find it and probably bring it up again. But it just this whole concept of watching people struggle, trying to do the right thing with people who maybe are also trying to do the right thing, and it becomes both a challenge and an impediment, which is not what you want when you're trying to be successful
And
with
that,
projects. And so, I mean, it's a really interesting area for me because I think it costs us and diminishes our ability to do what we really want to do. And so I think about it a lot, and this is just another area where I'm interested in learning more, shall we say, over
yeah,
time.
and we are trying to combine the 401, that's the regional boards, and the 404 into the ESA permitting
Great.
to make it less burdensome. Yep.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your
Thank
comments.
you.
Okay, I think next up is Tara and Richard Harris. They're going to give you a presentation on monitoring.
Hello.
Hi, Tara. Welcome.
Tara.
So maybe the last meeting or meeting before, you guys asked to know more about our monitoring and adaptive management program. And what does that mean? What are we doing when we are doing monitoring and adaptive management? And so I'm going to give you an overview of what our requirements are. So we are a permitting program, and so a lot of the requirements we have regarding monitoring and adaptive management are required by our permit. And so I'm just going to tell you what those requirements are, and then Richard is going to give you and talk more about how we monitor projects themselves. And then actually, I'm just going to call them the owl people. Are going to talk, what they're going to talk about is also kind of our status and trends, and also targeted studies, and also management monitoring. So I hope to give you kind of some of the tools to kind of the terminology that we use when we talk about these different types of monitoring. So why do we monitor? So here we have a nice little cartoon that shows the past and future. And so as part of our program, we want to know that our future has more than just a bug in it. And so we look at what do we have now, we monitor it over time, and then we take actions to ensure the persistence or increase of the resource that we're monitoring. We do care about bugs, especially the bay checker spot butterfly. So our program has 3 types of monitoring. 1, compliance monitoring, 2, effectiveness monitoring, and 3, targeted studies. So compliance monitoring. Doug had some questions about our permit and compliance budget item. So this compliance monitoring is part of that. So as part of compliance monitoring, we produce the annual report. That looks at all of our year summary of different items, and then a cumulative summary of items. So we look at impacts, land acquisition, restoration, monitoring, compliance with our stay-ahead provision, which means that our conservation is ahead of our impacts. And we combine all of that into an annual report. So the annual report represents our compliance monitoring of our program. It's all the metrics that we're required to track over time. So that's a big report, but what does that mean day to day? Like what types of monitoring, like when we had Heath come last time and talk about the plant surveys at Clara County Park, or when I come up here and talk about our restoration projects. Well, that's part of our effectiveness monitoring program. Are we achieving the biological goals and objectives of our program? And to know that, we have to track status and trends. So we look at a site, and I'm getting ahead of myself. So status and trends involves baseline inventory, so going out and see what's on there in the ground, and then changes over time. And if those changes are happening or in a way that we don't like, we will implement a project. Or we might see the baseline's not that good, and we want to do a restoration project or enhancement project, some sort of treatment. And then we do effects monitoring of that treatment. So we establish success criteria. We want to say, I have a hole in the ground here now, and I want a pond here later. And so that's part of our success criteria. And we measure the effects of that management. And so part of what Richard's going to present is how we do effects monitoring. So status and trends, this is very generic. Baseline inventory. Year 1, we have 1 owl. Year 2, we have 3 owls. Year 3, we have 2 owls. That, in essence, is our status and trends monitoring, or going out there and we're counting things. For effects monitoring, we generally have a project. So what I've been presenting on is the Clara Ponds project. So how long is the pond wet? For this project, we want to have a minimum of 2 feet of inundation through the end of August. Our species present for this project, for Clara Ponds, we want to have tiger salamander, red-legged frog, Mount Hamilton thistle, and pond turtle on the site. And what about threats? Are there things that are happening at the pond that we have to manage? So here's an example of the slope slumping, and so we went in there and fixed that. So we monitor the pond every month. I go out there and take a look at it, and then we also have people going out there actually measuring different metrics. So when I do my site visits to the pond, I'm really looking at what do we have to manage. All right, am I seeing a lot of invasive species out there? Am I seeing some slumping? Am I seeing people go out there and putting goldfish in my troughs? Yes, actually. So trying to see things that we have to manage. And then there's times where we really don't know what to do. And so we conduct targeted studies, or we have questions that need to be answered. And so we may do a targeted study for monitoring methodology, seeing how effective different management techniques are, or to resolve uncertainties. And many of these targeted studies are funded through our LAG grant program. So every year, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife releases grants to natural community conservation plans, and we've been getting 2 to 3 grants per year. So for example, the Open Space Authority has done a couple of connectivity studies through the LAG grant program, and we've been using that to inform, well, our kind of regional approach to conservation in the Coyote Valley region. So one of the target studies we've done through our program that we've sponsored ourselves is burrowing owl breeding surveys and wintering surveys. So we've looked to see where owls breeding in that same location. Are they also wintering there? And then what happens during the breeding season again? And so before we did this study, we knew we had owls breeding. We knew there was wintering owls somewhere. We didn't know where. And what we found through our targeted studies is that this is a very important area for wintering owls, even more, as well as breeding. So that's an example of a targeted study. And so using both status and trends and effects monitoring and these targeted studies, we implement adaptive management. So we assess a problem, we design a solution, we implement it, we monitor it, we evaluate, and we adjust. And that's pretty much how we manage. Sometimes it's official, where we have a result and we change what we actually do in monitoring, and then we change our actions. Sometimes it's just an observation, going out in the field, seeing something that's not going right, and then adjusting it. So that is a summary of our monitoring adaptive management program. I'm going to let Richard talk more about how we do our effects monitoring. He's going to walk through some examples of how we actually do monitoring rather than just the program itself. So if you can hold questions till after he presents, we can both answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara.
So can you guys see this?
We got a screen here in front of us.
Oh, okay, great. Because I can see three times, but I didn't know if you could see too. A little bit of background on me. I've known Ed for a long time because I worked up in Placer County on the HCP, NCCP on that project, and I started out and spent 20 years working at UC Berkeley as a extension specialist, and one of the things I got into very heavily was environmental monitoring, particularly in relationship to projects that either are trying to improve or restore fisheries habitat. So a lot of my work has been in that area, and some of my examples relate directly to that. Effectiveness monitoring, in my view, is trying to determine if a project or a treatment that you've installed to correct a problem actually works. And it's quite simple in my mind conceptually how that should be, but in reality it's very difficult to have to really assess that and to have some kind of measurable result. I was telling Tara and Ed when we went out before that my son, he's a high school senior, I said, well, what are you going to do tonight, Dad? And I said, well, I'm going to make a presentation on monitoring. What's that? I said, well, monitoring is, trying to evaluate to see how things are behaving. And, well, what kind of monitoring are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about monitoring, in many cases, projects to reduce erosion or improve stream conditions. Yeah, how do you do that? Well, one way you do that is you could measure the water quality before and after you do a project. And if you see that it's improved, then your treatment's been effective. How do you measure water quality? Well, you can do turbidity measurements. What's turbidity? Anyway, you kind of chase this down a rabbit hole, is what I'm trying to say. And so I want to try to make this as simple as possible because when you talk about monitoring, you quickly get into this kind of rabbit hole. So I want to make it real simple. All right, so the problem statement is the Habitat Agency has projects, and I'm involved in two of those projects to mitigate erosion and sediment delivery. San Felipe Creek, the cooperative work at Coyote Ridge, road improvements, those are examples. So you want to know if what you're paying for and doing actually works. So you need to have, as Tara mentioned, you need to know about effectiveness, whether it's being successful, so that you might change practices or through a process of adaptive management, improve what you're doing. So some potential treatments that I think the Habitat Agency will be involved in, and they currently are involved in. Riparian restoration. Mainly the intent there is to try to restore riparian vegetation to an area that has been degraded in the past. So when you think about Coyote Creek, or in our case, San Felipe Creek, where past land uses or changes in hydrology, for example, have caused riparian vegetation to decline, you want to bring it back up to its natural state. Road and stream crossing, upgrading, or removal. So in San Felipe, for example, they're installing treatments to try to improve the drainage on a trail. Those include drainage lenses and Arizona crossings, which are basically armored crossings of a watercourse. So you don't install a culvert, you just put an armored crossing. On the Coyote Ridge project, they're talking about drainage improvements there, including replacing culverts. So, you're involved in this stuff, right? So, trying to prevent channel erosion in gullies. Again, San Felipe Creek is an example of that, where there's gullies that they are installing treatments to try to prevent the further development of that gully or further incision to try to reverse it. Okay? Fuel modifications, which is one of my favorites. I mean, one of the things I did for the Habitat Agency was develop fuel management guidelines where you can reduce hazardous fuels and conservation reserves while still meeting the intent of the plan to protect the listed species. Okay, so that's another thing that you're going to be increasingly involved in that, I think, in the future. So conducting effectiveness monitoring, the first thing you need to do is you need to define what your criteria are. What are the success criteria? So is it a water quality standard? Is it a quantity of soil loss and sediment delivery? Are you trying to avoid sedimentation? It's occurring, you know how much is occurring, and you want to offset that. You have to then define the spatial and temporal scales for evaluation. Are you going to monitor over this period of time in these places? Are you going to replicate your monitoring in different locations? And the appropriate methods have to be selected. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those methods. So for spatial and temporal considerations, for site and project level evaluations, let's say that you go out and you realize that you have a deficient stream crossing and you want to replace that stream crossing to make it more effective at passing water, sediment, and entrained debris. So one of the things you might want to do is you want to look at water quality sampling above and below this treatment or before and after. You need to consider study designs that include replicates, because having just one location as opposed to multiple locations, you can be more, I guess you can be more certain if you have replicated examples that show the same results. For watershed level evaluations, you might have permanent installations. At San Felipe, they're installing what are called piezometers, and they're going to be measuring groundwater levels over time. So that's a permanent installation. I don't know what the time frame for that is. 10 years. For 10 years, they're going to monitor to see whether or not their treatments have resulted in raising the groundwater level. Okay, because that's going to, as a result, that's going to increase the likelihood you're going to get a good riparian vegetation cover. So sometimes long-term studies are going to be done with controls. Typically, those are pretty rare. I mean, we have very few long-term, for example, watershed scale studies in California. Most of those are on the coast. They require constant inputs of money, and because they don't have a sort of an immediate result, they're difficult to find funding for. So one of my favorite things is turbidity sampling. And for turbidity sampling, what you're doing is you're looking at sites and projects where you can do grab sampling. You're sampling occurring during storms or peak runoff events, and it's better to do above and below sampling as opposed to before and after sampling. So for example, one study that I did where we published results in a Western Journal of Applied Forestry, we looked at a series of places where they had replaced culverts to try to improve the delivery of sediment and to make it pass 100-year floods. Well, when they put those things in, we get adjustments, because when you change the base level in the stream, you might cause upstream aggradation and downstream incision. So what we were doing here is we did turbidity sampling, and we also did cross-sections on the stream to see how the channel adjusted to this, what was called an improvement. But there's always a short-term adjustment, so we were trying to monitor that to see how significant those adjustments were. And one way you can do that is doing above and below sampling, grab sampling, and comparing the measurements of water quality. You can estimate surface erosion by installing silt fences and sediment basins. This is a study that we did over in Mendocino County where we basically put in a lined pond, if you will, to capture ditch flow to see how much sediment was coming down off this road and being collected into this ditch. I mean, from this ditch, right? So we wait until after the peak flows. We look at the sediment accumulation there. In this case, we have actually an excavator that comes along, picks up this whole thing and weighs it. And then we have an idea of what the quantity of sediment is that's delivered off this road. So when we look at improving this, we want to disconnect that ditch from the stream because that sediment is going directly into the stream. And that becomes our measure of avoided sedimentation because we stop that amount of sediment from getting in the stream. You can do channel surveys, like when I was talking about these adjustments after you replace a culvert. You do a longitudinal profile where you see whether or not the stream is actually incising below the treatment. Here's a study that we did over at the Hopland Field Station at UC. That gully, if you can believe it, was created by a single outfall from a culvert on the road above this. And what we did is we disconnected that culvert from that gully, and then we did successive measurements, cross-sections of that gully to see whether or not we had stopped the gully erosion. And over time, as the side slopes slough in there, it actually fills up. So cutting off the water is actually the treatment, right? Rather than throwing in car bodies. Photo monitoring is one of my favorite things, and I want to show you something in a minute here. This is an example of where a stream crossing was upgraded, the before, right after they did it, and then after, and when the vegetation established on those cut banks. So some examples here. I think the best thing to do would be just go right to the other thing, and that would, because that's actually what you're doing out there. So if you want to just cut that one off and go to the presentation that I have, or to the slides that I have for San Felipe. Okay, at San Felipe, I'm doing two things. I'm doing physical measurements using a checklist to determine whether or not what they have done out there actually meets the design criteria, but I'm also doing pre and post photo monitoring. So I want to just show you how that works, right? I've done the photo monitoring twice already, and this is going to be the third pass. What we're looking at now is going to be revegetation. So these are the treatment areas. Corral Trail, and in a gully that they are, they created a swale for. Another gully, step pools installed in a gully. So these are all the places where they have done their treatments. And what I'm going to be doing with this is that pair this photograph with a post-treatment photograph so you can see this is what it looked like before they did the treatment, this is what it looked like after the treatment. And we've done this for the physical changes, the grading, the installation of structures, and now we're going to do it for the revegetation. So this is just a sort of a practical example of how you actually do it. And I tell you, before-after photograph exhibits, like they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So measurements are one thing, but I think photo monitoring in many cases will do the job quite nicely. So we'll be doing the post-revegetation photo monitoring in November after they're done with all the planting. And you can see there's a whole bunch of different things that they're doing out there. And we have a lot of places to evaluate. Other than that, I think I'll just take questions from you. I hope I haven't driven you nuts.
No, not at all. Thank you for the presentation. We appreciate it. So my first question, and I'll start out I had something written down. So these guidelines that are set forth by the agencies for requirements to monitor and adaptive management and all that, is there any requirement to achieve certain parameters or numbers or results by the agencies, or are we just sort of taking in the data, collecting it, publishing it, and then reassessing as we move forward? What's the need? Like if you have 2 owls and then you have 3 owls and then you go back down to 2, do the agencies, are they concerned about this? Do we have to have certain results?
Yeah. Oh, I won't speak to the biology. I'll let the biologists speak to that. But I will tell you that in terms of like physical changes, that revegetation or reducing water quality impacts, you'll be looking at water quality standards, achieving water quality standards. There's certain levels of turbidity, for example, that are considered impaired water bodies. And what you're trying to do is move away from that level of impairment to a level that is essentially benign. It's not going to have an adverse effect. The other thing with revegetation, and Fish and Wildlife, for example, funds lots of riparian revegetation projects. What they want to see is a reduced amount of bare ground. And they want to see the development of structural diversity over time. They want to see trees and shrubs, and vertical diversity in the vegetation. So there are standards that the agencies apply. In the case of San Felipe, for example, some criteria have been set up for them to be able to claim credit for what they're doing. And maybe Tara could talk to that, but these are very specific criteria. And they're expressed in acres or linear feet or however they are. And so our measurement of effectiveness is that we restored X number of acres or X amount of stream length. That's the way it kind of works. For biology, it's different because in many cases you're dealing with rare species that they may not have viable populations, and you can't just look at it on a sort of project by project basis. But I'll let the owl guys talk about that.
Thank you.
Let me just jump in for a second. I think I turned this on. So we do have specific goals we're working towards overall. So the plan itself has biological goals and objectives, and pretty much any project or any acquisition or any management action we take is linking towards achieving those biological goals and objectives. So for example, for San Felipe, we have to restore a certain length of stream during our permit term, also a certain number of acres of riparian restoration, as well as restoring wetlands. And so that project is geared towards achieving those biological goals and objectives. And the kind of effectiveness monitoring that goes along with that is to ensure that we're moving toward, that those acreage targets will be achieved. So it serves as kind of an interim monitoring to inform management to ensure that larger goals are met. So all the projects we implement are working towards achieving specific goals of the habitat plan. They're not just chosen at random. So for the owls, we have to establish a breeding population that's stable and then increasing over time. So to do that, we basically have to add 2 new I think it's 2 breeding pairs per year is the goal.
Wow.
And so if we're not doing that, we enter into this tier 3 category, which we are in. And so that's kind of part of our adaptive management program for the burrowing owl.
I'd like to talk a little bit about fish because I am really familiar with fish, right? And also water levels and things like, that have to do with really adjudicated water rights and effects on fish. And one of the problems we have with fish is, from year to year, the populations of anadromous salmonids that come into streams is extremely variable. So you don't know whether you're going up or you're going down because because one year you're going up, and the next year you go down. And so trying to establish a long-term trend in any kind of biological population is extremely difficult from year to year. I asked the owl guys before, hey, if the owls are declining, is it because of the drought? Are the fish populations declining because of the drought? So there's all sorts of problems in biological monitoring. And again, I was consulted on the recovery team for the Central Coast steelhead. And when I heard about, how they were approaching it and, with models essentially, right, that predict future populations, it's almost inevitable that those models somewhere along the line break down and you come to reality, which is that fish populations are variable. So it's very difficult. Other questions for me?
Yeah, just one thing, Joseph. So we're trying to get credit from 3 regulatory agencies. So the wildlife agencies is sort of one bundle, and then the regional board and the U.S. Army Corps. So some of the focus on water quality is being driven by the regional board and what we know is important for them. And some of the other, a lot of the work's being done, I think Richard alluded to it, to make sure we can get more water into the meadow and more water into the creek. And that the time of sort of the water seeping into the groundwater system and more slowly going into creek, meaning you'll have water in the creek over a longer period of time, which is better for the vegetation and the species.
Right.
So part of it is, a lot of this work is to try to undo what was done historically there and to try to create more of a natural system that functions more like a natural system where you have a wetter meadow and where you have more water seeping into the creek, subsurface flows into the creek over time. I mean, that's a seasonal drainage, so it's going to dry up at some point, but try to have it longer periods of being wet, which really helps the vegetation, and trying to get more native vegetation in that area.
And so you're not actually mitigating for the work that you're doing, you're mitigating for some past occurrence that's been problematic.
It's a restoration.
Yeah, it's also like Tara said, it's to meet those goals,
Right.
To get credit from the water board for when a permittee like Dick comes in and needs coverage for whatever impact he has. We have credit available that he can say, hey, it's my project's being mitigated over there. And then like Tara alluded to, the various conservation objectives we have to restore 10 miles of stream over 50 years. So this is 1.82 miles of stream that's being restored. So that goes a long way to meeting that 10 miles.
Okay, thank you very much. Other questions? Julie?
First of all,
Thanks.
thank you so much for bringing this to us. We had talked about it last time, so I really appreciate it. I also really appreciated you made it simple, made it easy to understand, so I really enjoyed that. So a couple of things. Richard, also thank you. And by the way, I just wanted to thank you for it, and I just want to also say congratulations that you have an 18-year-old who's interested in asking what you do. Not all of them are.
Short memory span, right?
That's okay. They ask. That's good. My questions are actually maybe sort of off base here, not so much on the presentation, but definitely a picture is worth 1,000 words. I think that's really effective, the photo monitoring. You use that for public presentations and they get it. But I'm wondering a little bit further on public access to be able to see it. Is there anything within the future of Coyote Ridge where there would be opportunity on a docent tour, I would imagine, where either the Public Advisory Committee are opening up to other folks like Mr. Muirhead to be able to see that work that is done? I'm just curious.
Yes, and and Tara is planning and Jerry are planning another trip. So this is at Grant Park, the San Felipe Creek. no, it's fine, but the Coyote Ponds is at Coyote Ridge.
Yeah.
So yes, there'll be opportunities to, in the spring.
San Felipe Road, which.
Yeah, right. So yeah, there'll be opportunities, yeah.
Okay,
We're
great.
planning a spring field trip. So similar to what we did this past year, where we visited Clara Pond project and did a little walk there. We'll probably drive all the way to the site and then walk the entire restoration site. You can go there now, actually. It's open to the public on the weekends. It's all, yeah, so the part of the project was actually improving trails. So it's off the hotel and Corral Trail at Grant County Park. We close it during the week just because of vehicle traffic, but right now it's all open on the weekends. You can actually access the site.
Okay,
Not that I'll take you there in the spring, though.
that's fine. I was just
Station
thinking,
will be there too. in the
yeah,
spring,
I was
yeah.
just thinking that you would have to have that part, the restoration part, off limits for a while until you see that it's taken and things are healthy and, you're kind of worried
Ideally,
about folks
yes.
trampling this.
Yeah.
And
So Grant Park doesn't get a ton of use. And so we have it limited during the week, but on the weekends, we have it noticed that it's a restoration area and to stay on the trails. But as part of the county parks, Park Charter Fund is public access. So we really can't limit access. We've had a few, we can see footprints. So we've had a few curious people go through there, but really no one's been in the project area since we started.
Other questions? Craig?
Thanks for going through that. A more general question about the process. What percentage of when you're monitoring or setting up a project is based on previous reports of similar projects that have been done? The point being is, do you start from scratch? It sounds like you're starting from scratch on every project and doing the whole thing. And it seems to me that somebody somewhere has probably done this same thing or very similar to it. I know you can't replicate it 100%, but what percentage of it do you use as going back and getting information that's already been done that you're not having to replicate?
So for example, for San Felipe Creek, we worked with Balance Hydrologics as our design team, and they have done this before. And so as part of the project, they're implementing quite a few design features. Are you talking about the monitoring or the project itself?
Either one, your choice.
So for San Felipe, I actually went on a site visit with them up in the Sierras around Lake Tahoe to see some of the different design elements that we've incorporated into San Felipe, because I said, I see these drawings, but I have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay.
Because it's hard.
Now you know how we feel sometimes.
Yeah, so it's hard. It was hard for me to understand, sticking the ground this way versus sticking around that way and what it would do. And so they brought me out to projects that had been in the ground for a few years and showed me the structures, told me about how they performed in the past, and kind of did a show and tell. And the exciting thing about San Felipe is that it's a system that's very flashy. But under climate change, we're going to see fewer, stronger storms. And so that's really like how the Sierra is already built, is for like strong storms. So they're able to bring a lot of these different design elements that they use in the Sierra for like big storm events, and they put it into our project. It is a big experiment. And we're fortunate to have such a large area to experiment in for this particular project.
Okay, so that answers, you hire consultants to do that?
Yes.
Okay, that's the simple answer.
I'm an expert in everything, but
Well,
sometimes
I know
there's
you
people
are,
that know
and I
other-
know you know a lot about a lot of things, but I was just wondering how you,
Yeah, no, we
use
hire,
that.
so we
The specialists who have been doing this. Okay,
Correct.
I guess, I knew you hired consultants, but I didn't know exactly how you were
and
doing
then
that.
even
So,
for the monitoring, for Calero, that project was a little bit difficult to get off the ground, and so we have a good construction monitoring team this time around. So Richard's part of that team. I also have Keish Environmental helping me day to day out on San Felipe. And so Richard established all of these pre-project photo sites. So we took pre-project and post-project photos, and we'll carry that throughout the duration of the project.
okay.
Other questions? Jan?
Yeah, so I maybe want to clear up some confusion on my part. So we've talked about kind of a adaptive monitoring in this context at San Felipe Creek and Calero Ponds, say. And so I sort of figure that we're doing adaptive management on just properties that are part of the reserve system. But in both those cases, that's not part of the reserve system yet.
Correct,
But
we're treating it as if it is.
Okay.
Yeah, so for Calero, for example, this year, we didn't have to drain the pond. It drained on its own, but all the bullfrogs moved up to the upper wetland, so we drained that. So that's part of adaptive management.
And then you said that in the case of San Felipe Creek, there was also some connection with the trails.
Correct.
And I don't understand what that is, but I'll understand in the spring. But my question was, so Coyote Ridge roads appeared in the presentation here.
Correct.
So is that then also connected with the Open Space Authority's plan to
Open the park.
open the park? So,
Do you want to know more about this?
well, I just kind of want to make, so that's kind of the road that we're talking about, is the road to the top, or
There's two.
multiple roads?
So it's a multi-partner project with Open Space Authority, ourselves, and PG&E. So PG&E uses those roads to access all their facilities on Coyote Ridge. There's both a lower road and upper road. We actually, right now, are fixing the lower road because it's in a less environmentally sensitive area, and I had to get a handle on how crazy PG&E would be to work with. So we didn't want to start with the real seriously restrictive area.
And the answer is?
They're very responsive.
Okay, great.
They've been great to work with so far. So I've been very happy. So phase 2 is working on that upper road. And so that does, this lower road, we're just we're doing like 4 different treatments to it. So we're putting some rock lenses in, rolling dips, some fabric in some areas, and then outsloping the road and then rocking it. And so it's pretty straightforward work on an existing road. Up on the upper road, we're going to actually be moving the alignment of the road in some areas where it's dangerous, frankly, to drive on when it's wet. So
does public access, like as the Open Space Authority plans, is that then dependent on kind of the completion of this, or is that?
it's separate.
It's really separate.
Yeah, they have their own plans for opening Coyote Ridge, and we support that. And we're helping them, for example, with the Malik staging area. So that's going to come online in a few years. And I think that's part of what's driving the access to that site.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
And just one thing with, we've developed a good relationship with PG&E, so we approached them about, okay, you use this road, would you pay for improving it? And they said yes. So I would view, so this is being done at minimal cost to OSA and to the Habitat Agency. So hats off to PG&E, though sometimes they get a bad reputation for things that go on, but in this, they've been a great partner to work with, and we've built up a really good relationship with them over the last 4 years. So
I just don't want to hear
and
about
it's
any
paying
fires
off.
up there.
Pardon me?
Just don't want to hear about any fires up there.
No.
Okay, great, thank you.
Other questions? No?
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentations.
my way down to 680.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So now we have the owl people.
I didn't realize I could have been an owl person for Halloween. Okay. My name is Troy Ramick. I'm with ICF. My annual sojourn to this group and others to talk about burrowing owls. I appreciate coming every year and telling you kind of the latest and greatest what we're finding with the owls as we do our monitoring. This year, we're going to do kind of a two-part presentation. So I'm going to start out and give you again, the update on the annual monitoring and kind of the status of the owl population in the South Bay area, where we are, where we're going. And then Senator Menzel is going to come up here and give you a pretty high-level overview of the myriad of things that are happening with burrowing owls research-wise. There's a lot going on with burrowing owls. And I'll maybe say, even before we get into that, we're going to keep it at a fairly high level and give you just a taste of every little thing that's happening. And if at some point, and of course we'll have lots of questions, and that's all fine. If there are items that, research projects or things that are going on that you want to know more about and want to deeper dive on, we can always come back, we being probably Sandra and Dr. Lynn Trulio and others could come back and go deeper on any of those topics. So there is a lot going on. It's actually quite exciting right now. So just as maybe a quick reminder, I think all of you know this already, but just so we're all on the same page, one of the things that we did when we developed the habitat plan was this sort of separate burrowing owl conservation strategy. They're they're only one of several covered species, but they're unique enough that they sort of required special attention. That's both in terms of where they exist relative to the other covered species. They're mostly in the urban area right now. And what we needed to do to get a handle on the population and the trends over time. It's a little bit more intensive with owls early on here compared to the other species, for example. So we have this whole separate strategy. And the main kind of backbone of that strategy to inform how owls are doing and how we should be responding to the populations is this annual monitoring effort. So we go out every year, and I'll explain who that is, goes out every year and monitors the nesting population, so really kind of March to August or September, to get a handle on how many adult owls are in the area during the nesting season and how many young they're producing. And then that then influences how and where we collect burrowing owl conservation fees. Craig, you mentioned that earlier, and I'll get into that a little bit in a minute. So this year, like other years, we focus most of our survey effort on a handful of key nesting locations. I'll show you where those are and explain more about those, but I would say we probably split our time 50-50, half of it on the areas where we know there are owls, just getting a handle on how many are there and how are they doing. And then we spend the other half of our time in other parts of the plan area, the study area, to make sure that we are finding any other owls that might be out, in the hills or down the valley here. We end up surveying a lot of areas where we don't find owls, so we could spend all of our time just looking at the places where we know we have owls, but then we wouldn't know much about what was happening in the rest of the county. So we kind of split our time that way, and that's done through what we have lovingly now termed the South Bay Burrowing Owl Survey Network. And I say that because some of that work is directly funded by the Habitat Agency, and then a lot of it is done by other folks that are doing burrowing owl monitoring for their own reasons, either an agency that's doing it to meet a mitigation requirement, or San Jose Airport, who does it to make sure that they are minimizing risk to aircraft. Moffett Airfield does that for the same reason. So there's a lot of different reasons why people are looking for burrowing owls, and what we're really trying to do is just coordinate and collect all of that information into sort of a cohesive report each year. This is a list of everyone. Probably, actually, it's not everyone. There's probably somebody that we've missed here, but this is basically the list of everyone who's involved in that monitoring effort. So you can see it is quite a coordination effort. A lot of different entities, many of which are not actually, parties to the habitat plan. Moffett Airfield, City of Mountain View, for example. One of the challenges when we wrote the plan long ago was that we have a few owls inside of our permit area, but a lot of the burrowing owls in the South Bay area are actually just outside of the Habitat Plan's permit area. So we made this effort to kind of pull that whole South Bay burrowing owl research community together so that we could gain the most thorough picture about the population as we can over time. This is a pretty high level, you're not expected to be able to read this, but this is a pretty high level view of the monitoring effort, and this varies a little bit year to year. Basically, in this map, the green areas are areas that were monitored this year. The red areas are areas that had been monitored at some point in the past, but we didn't monitor this year. On the right-hand side, you can't read it, but you can see there's a long list of like 50 some odd individual locations, and those are individual, sites that we track over time. The general idea is here, because we're splitting our time between places where we know there are owls and places where we're hoping to find additional owls, we can't hit every place every year, so we kind of try to make sure we hit those places at least once every 2 or 3 years, so we're cycling through making the best use of the funds that are available each year for monitoring. This is the breakdown, and I'll show you these numbers and some graphs in a couple of different ways here. What you're looking at are the numbers on the left in each column. So there's the number of adults in the center column there, and then the number of young fledged in the right-hand side.
Only during the breeding area, right?
What's that?
It's only during the breeding season.
Only during the breeding season. That's correct. Yes, yes. So this is number of adult owls present during the breeding season. And the numbers on the left there are what we found this year, and then just for a quick reference, the numbers on the right are what we found last year, so 2017. So you can see if you just go all the way to the bottom line there, we had 50 adult owls in the South Bay area this year. There were 74 last year, so that's a pretty big drop. We can talk about why. Interestingly, we saw that even with 74 owls last year, we only produced 64 young. This year, with only 50 owls, we produced 80 to 81 young. So there were fewer owls breeding, but they were more productive this year. And again, we can talk about why, and Sandra will kind of talk about that a little bit, I suspect. This is where they are, where they were this year, and where they actually have been really for most of our work here. No big surprises. The locations that you see there up in the northern part of the county are really San Jose Airport, the regional wastewater. Actually, I don't know if I can. Can you see that? Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
San Jose Airport here, the San Jose Santa Clara Regional Wastewater Facility. A little bit further north from that is the Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge. And then as you go to the west, you have Moffett Airfield, Shoreline at Mountain View and Moffett Airfield. So those are basically where the owls are. There are actually some down in San Benito County, right south, right across the county line as well. And that's been kind of the case for a few years now. This graphic shows you, so one of the things we do, we developed this, the burrowing owl conservation fee as part of a way to fund the program. And that really tracks it. It's like a 3-year moving window. If owls are found nesting, we basically put a half-mile buffer around those owls. And then that's what we call occupied burrowing owl habitat. So it includes the nest site and about a half-mile of foraging habitat as well. And we track that year over year, and it changes a little bit. And when we set up the fee area, it actually includes not just this year, but the last 3 years. So when we start in a second, I'll show you what the new sort of fee map for next year looks like. And that includes survey results from 2018, 2017, and 2016. And that's what you're seeing here on this map. 2016 is the blue, 2017 is the pink, and then 2018 is the hatched orange. So you can see that it's, they're moving around a little bit. The population is moving around a little bit. They're generally in the same location, but they are contracting a little bit. So, Craig, to a question you had earlier about the burrowing owl money, one of the things that is happening and was expected to happen is that as the city continues to build out, we're going to lose owls that are kind of spread around the South County area because there's going to be less foraging habitat and fewer places for them to breed. So there will be fewer places over time where we're actually collecting burrowing owl conservation fees. That's already happening. So we have collected, whatever, the $6 million or whatever, 3/4 of the total that was expected in the first 5 years. And that really does have to last us, for the rest of the permit term. Now, we have some ideas about how we might attract additional money into the program, from other sources, whether it be grants or foundations or whatever. But as far as fees go, you can see that these areas which will make up the fee area, they're largely around these kind of public facilities. And there's not a lot, I mean, there's still a little bit of development happening around the edges of Moffett, for example, and as Ed mentioned, there will be probably some that happens around the regional wastewater facility, that might trigger fees, but there's not a lot of new places where we're going to be collecting burrowing owl fees in the future. I mentioned already the kind of the key locations. These are the same key locations we've been monitoring forever, really, around here. And nothing really has changed there. There's success stories, in each of these areas. There are, some precipitous declines in some of the areas as well. So it's each site sort of has its own story. Here's a breakdown of the sites, and so we've been doing this. This is the 5th year. This is all 5 years in front of you here, and I think the biggest takeaway from this is the pretty large decline at the San Jose Airport and at Moffett Airfield. I think we've talked to you before about the potential reasons for that. San Jose Airport is being managed a little differently than it had been in the past. Their wildlife services are contracted out to the USDA, like many airports are around the country, and they, I'll just leave it at that. Maybe they're managing differently than they used to. Moffett Airfield, slightly different story there. As you may or may not know, but Moffett Airfield, the active airfield hasn't changed much, but the surrounding lands around Moffett, actually a lot of it has been developed. A lot of it's been developed by Google and other entities. So there's actually less habitat, quite a bit less habitat at Moffett than there used to be, and there's certainly a lot less foraging habitat at Moffett. So it's sort of the same old story that we always get with owls, where they're getting a little constrained there. There are some success stories here, obviously. We now have owls at places like the regional wastewater facility, where we always had a few owls there over the years, but now we have a pretty steady population. It is down this year, and that that may be of concern. It may bounce back again next year. And then similarly, at Don Edwards, the Warm Springs unit at Don Edwards, they a long time ago had a lot of owls there, and then they kind of blinked out for a period of time when they changed their grazing regime. And we've been able to work with them, we being the Habitat Agency, and collectively work with them to reestablish owls there. We would like to see more owls there, and that's part of the aim over the next few years, but there's more there than there have been in a while. Another notable thing on this graph is that you see at the bottom there the row that says other locations. So besides these key areas, we have always historically had a few owls kind of scattered around the San Jose area. A pair here, a pair there, or whatever. We don't really have those anymore, and in part that's because of the continued development of the area and the build out, the loss of what was remaining little patches of foraging habitat and nesting habitat around. So that's not surprising. I don't know if it's really a good thing or a bad thing. They weren't necessarily like super sustainable populations. They were always sort of surrounded by urbanization anyhow. But it was always nice to have them there, a little bit of redundancy built into the population, and we just don't have that anymore. So that's something notable. This is just sort of graphically what has happened over the years. So really the most important thing here is the orange line, and that's the total population. That's the collection or the addition of all of those other smaller populations that we've already talked about.
What year does that go back to?
1990.
90, okay.
Now, the one thing I'll point out, I always like to point out when I show this graph, is that, monitoring, I would say, has been variable at best going back to 1990, right? We know for sure that monitoring has been consistent since 2014, because that's when this coordination effort started up. So I think this is it gives you a pretty good trend line on what's happened with owls, in the last 20 years or so, or 30 years. But there is a survey effort in here. Like there may have been more owls or, at any one point in time here where people just weren't looking for them systematically like we are now. But it does give you a pretty good sense of how things have been over time. And then really quickly, this sort of goes back to the previous conversation about monitoring. So when we started down the road of implementation of the habitat plan, one of the things we were striving for with burrowing owls, Tara mentioned it earlier, was to create a sustained and increasing, and over time, an increasing burrowing owl population. During plan development, we did what's called a population viability analysis, like how much does the burrowing owl population have to grow over time in order to be sustainable in this geography? And the outputs of that analysis essentially showed, as again Tara alluded to, we need to add, from where we started, 5 years ago, we need to add about 3 adult owls to the population every year, on average. So what this line shows you is a hypothetical world where that happened, we actually got those 3 owls every year, and what that might look like over the 50-year permit term. You can see you get all the way up to, whatever it is, around 210 owls or something, adult owls. And this is kind of where we are, where we've been tracking over the last 5 years. So we started out with a bang. We thought we were doing great, but that could have just been because we actually started monitoring for owls. In the last few years, we have seen a bit of a dip. This year has been the lowest that we have tracked in the last 5 years. But you can see that in the last 3 years, for sure, we have been quite a bit below that trend line. Again, there's nothing magical about that line. That's a hypothetical line, but it gives us some gauge as to how are we doing, relative to where we need to be to have a sustainable population over time. So in sort of an adaptive management realm, the conservation strategy built in this idea of these tier 3 kind of recovery strategies, which Ed alluded to. Sandra's going to talk about the beginnings of some of those that we're working on. And effectively what the plan says is that we're taking in all this money from these burrowing owl fees, and if we aren't achieving this trend line, basically, for a period of time, which it actually says 3 years, that we will begin to shift that money to these active recovery actions. So things like potentially captive rearing or supplemental feeding, all things that Sandra is going to talk about in more detail here in a second. But actually start actively managing the population, not just monitoring it and buying land, but actually trying to increase the numbers of owls in various ways experimentally. So that's the road we're headed down now. It's not a road that any of us want to be headed down, but it's not a road that we're surprised that we're headed down, I would say, because when we wrote the plan, we built this in from the beginning because we knew the first 10 years of implementation was going to be critical for this population. The burrowing owl population in the South Bay area has been in decline for some time. It's an relatively urban population, and it's been losing habitat, pretty readily for the last, I would say, 15 or 20 years. And so we're now at a sort of a save the owls point in time. And luckily, I think we have the funds now, and we have the expertise in the area to do that. So that's encouraging. And then finally, I mentioned how the monitoring eventually does translate to the fee zones. This is something that the implementation board and governing board actually will vote on. They vote on it every year. So we, after we do the monitoring, we say, okay, how have things looked over the last 3 years, and then we turn that into basically where will we be collecting burrowing owl fees in 2019. That's what this map looks like. You can see it's, again, pretty restricted, just around the airport, around the regional wastewater facility, and a little bit down in the southern part of the county where some of those San Benito owls are existing. And so this is the map that will be considered for approval by the boards next month, or actually I think it's probably going to be in January or something, but this will be the map that goes into effect next year. And I mentioned the San Benito owls. We're spending a little bit more time, even though San Benito County is effectively outside of the plan area. We have long had a plan to try to convince the owls to move to Santa Clara County. And we're still doing our best to do that, but they haven't done so yet. So they're still in San Benito County. But we are tracking them a little more closely, even though they're outside of the plan area, because there is some promise there, I think, if we could do some enhancement projects just on the Santa Clara County side of the line, that we could attract some owls north. There's a few pair that we know about that have nested down in San Benito County, and that's historically how it's been. We'll probably spend more time in 2019 surveying down there just to get a better handle on the situation. But it is an area of interest, even though it's just across the political boundary. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sandra. She can give you an overview of all the fun stuff that is happening with burrowing owls, and then I'll be around for questions if needed.
Good evening. As Troy mentioned, I will just touch on all these different projects that we have been engaged with, and then if you have questions, we can go into it in more depth. I just right-click. Okay, so banding has been conducted for several years, and we continued that. And every breeding season, adult and juvenile birds are banded at the 4 main locations that Troy already described. And that helps us not only to gather demographic data, but also look at movement patterns. So once we know who is who and the birds are banded, we can see where they're moving from maybe one breeding season to the other, to one breeding location to another. And it may also help us figure out some inbreeding that may be happening are related owls breeding with each other, which is always a problem with small populations. Another project that has been concluded this year was a 4-year study of wintering burrowing owls. We notice every year there's an influx of owls coming into the breeding locations. As you can see, the breeding locations get an increase in numbers every winter, and then during the summers, the numbers go down again. And then we also looked at the higher elevation sites where we know there were wintering owls, but we wanted to know how many are there. And so we trapped and banded owls up in the wintering locations as well. And yeah, as you can see, every winter owls are coming in and are nesting. We had one exciting catch of an owl that had come all the way from British Columbia. It was banded that year as a young bird, and it came all the way to our area to overwinter. What we do notice, though, is that when we band the wintering owls in the upper elevation locations, we do not see those birds down in the breeding locations the next summer. And the other way around, the birds that we band at the breeding locations during the breeding season, we do not see those birds at upper elevations. So they are really 2 separate populations. The migrants that come through every year, and then our resident population that probably moves a little bit, but basically stays resident pretty much. Another project that we want to start is inducing wintering burrowing owls to remain and breed. So all these birds that come every year, how can we maybe convince some of those to stay and breed in this area? And this is just a pilot study. It has never been done before. We don't know how successful it may or may not be. With other species, something like that has been tried, but not with burrowing owls. And so we just try something new at 2 locations this year. One is at Shoreline, at a low elevation site where we know we have breeding owls, and we know we get a lot of migrant owls every year. And we already have installed a few new artificial burrows. And once the migrants arrive, which is right now, we will start feeding them, make them fat and happy, and see if that helps them change their mind to maybe stay. And we will trap and band monthly, again, to see who's who, and so that we can differentiate between the breeding birds and the migrant birds. And again, the hope is that when we feed the owls, that they find it valuable to just stay on and not go back to where they came from. Another site, Sierra Vista, we know we get migrant owls during the winter every year, but they leave every breeding season. They go up north. And so as a first step, we have installed new artificial burrows up at the high elevation. And we also installed trail cameras to see if the artificial burrows will be used during the winter. And then we would love to find out to see if those owls use the area as a stepping stone to migrate on, or do they stay all winter long? And so we hope that we can maybe get some results there. And did I have anything else on that one? That's pretty much it. I just spoke with Philip Higgins, who works at Shoreline, and I just said they installed artificial burrows there, and he said they installed it, let's say, one Saturday, and the next Tuesday he already saw owls using them. So the owls are really attracted to those artificial burrows. They like the disturbance and the fresh soil, and it works. Every time we do it, they are really attracted to artificial burrows. At Sierra Vista, I just went up there yesterday, actually, and there was an owl near the artificial burrows that we installed, but not at them. But he used, or she, an owl used natural burrows very close by those artificial burrows. And I hope that I get some imagery on those cameras, but I haven't checked them out yet. Supplemental feeding. We have fed birds supplementally during the breeding seasons for 2 years now. This year was really successful, it seems. We found that the fed adults and juveniles during the breeding season produced twice as many young as the unfed pairs. That is a really good result. And the offspring that were fed weighed significantly more than the unfed birds. We will continue that. The birds are fed twice a week, about 3 or 4 mice that we place into the burrow entrance. You can see that's one image we got from a trail camera. They do eat them readily. And again, this year we got really good results, and we hope that we can replicate that over time. That can only have positive outcomes. We don't see any negative effects from feeding, so we will definitely continue that. And then we conducted a study assessing habitat of public lands and open space. So as we already described, we know where the birds are on land that we don't have a lot of control over, like the airport, like Moffett, like Shoreline. We have a lot of problems with development. At Shoreline, we have problems with the public disturbing the owls. So the idea behind this study was to really systematically survey public lands that is already protected, but we do not have a good feel for the numbers on public land because it's not surveyed as much. In the other areas, because they are so urban, we have so many eyes on the birds that we know the numbers, but in all the big open spaces, we just don't. And so we surveyed owls at 18 locations during the winter and at 24 locations during the breeding season. We did an ArcGIS study to see where suitable habitat is for the owls to begin with. We looked at vegetation types and soil types to see which habitats are used by the owls elsewhere, and then we applied that to the bigger area to see where the most suitable habitat is, and then again targeted those areas with surveys. And we covered a lot of mileage, 283 kilometers of random transects, and we assumed about 100-meter view shed along those transects for 42 square kilometers of survey area. And those public spaces included, the most northern sites were at Levin, and then all the way down to Sergeant Ranch in the south. Tulare Hill was one of the sites that we surveyed during the winter. And then during the breeding season, we focused a little bit more on the flatland areas because we know that the owls nest in the lower elevation areas. And the results is that, unfortunately, we did not discover any additional nesting birds. We did observe birds in the winter at 3 locations. 2 we were already familiar with. One was Tulare Hill and one was Sergeant Ranch, and the third one at Harvey Bear County Park, which was not recorded before, so that was exciting. And then during those surveys, we also identified high-quality habitat that is not occupied but could potentially with long-term management be made more attractive to owls. And then, once managed, hopefully owls will move into these areas. In September, we went to British Columbia to visit captive breeding facilities. Troy came along, Lynn Trulio, two people from the Peninsula Humane Society Wildlife Care Center, Nicole Wieger and Tani Myers. And we got a grand tour of their facilities, 2 facilities, and then also at locations where they release owls. So they breed owls for decades. They release about 100 each year that are bred in captivity out into the wildlands. A lot of them do not return. They may short stop somewhere in Idaho or Oregon. We don't know. A lot of them, we know, die. 70% of young burrowing owls do not survive. What we did learn, and that was really positive, is that the owls do really well in captivity. They
do or don't?
They do, yeah. That was really good to see. We had no idea what to expect, but they do really well. They do not imprint. Unfortunately, we did not need to wear those burrowing owl outfits. That was disappointing. And so, they have been doing this very successfully. It didn't seem like the owls were stressed. They were flying all over the place, and then they take them out to the field in the spring, pair them up, put them into enclosures, keep them in an enclosure for 2 weeks to get them used to the site. They feed them, and then they release them. And hopefully they will pair up to reproduce in the wild. We did visit to get a feel of what it takes to have birds in captivity. One of the ideas is to take juvenile birds into captivity for the winter so that their chances of survival increase. As I said, young birds have a very high rate of mortality, but others have tried this before. They take young birds that fledge that year into captivity and then keep it in captivity for the winter, raise it, and then release it in pairs into the field the following spring. And the one picture, this picture shows one of those enclosures. They are kept in for, as I said, 2 weeks as pairs, and then the hope is that they will pair up and reproduce in that location once the enclosure is taken away. The Peninsula Humane Society has a wild life care center, and they would have the facility to take in those birds and overwinter them. Did you have anything to add there?
Maybe just add that I think a lot of this, you probably remember a couple of years ago, we had a few outside science advisors come in and tell us what they know about burrowing owl recovery. One of those, a guy named Troy Willicombe, was from Canada, and he said, we've been doing this in Canada for a long time, and talked about a couple of techniques that they've been using and encouraged us to go up, reach out and go up and meet with the folks in British Columbia to learn more about what they've been doing. So that was the genesis of the whole process. The fact that we know, just like everyone else, we're losing a lot of birds year over year. We thought of that, we're looking for low-hanging fruit here. Like, how can we boost the numbers of owls in our population the quickest? And I think the combination of supplemental feeding and this, captive overwintering exercise might be the first step down that road. And, it was great to go up there and just talk to people who have been doing it for such a long time and seemingly just sort of like ho-hum about having 50 burrowing owls in an aviary flying around, which was pretty crazy to see. I have videos on my phone if you want to see later. But yeah, that's about all I had to add.
Yeah, and so the idea again is to take birds in and then release them at known breeding locations first, because we know they're doing well there. And then once we work out the kinks and we know it's working, and we know what we are doing, then we can maybe take young and bring them to other locations to start basically new populations. But that's hopeful. And again, the first step would be just to have maybe 5 pairs, so 10 to 15 young we would take in. We would have to sex them. Hopefully we get a fairly good ratio, male, female, and then have 5 pairs and bring them back to locations where we know they do well. And if we successfully do that, then we can maybe step it up a little bit and release them in other locations. One of those might be Coyote Valley. That is, I think, it. Any questions?
Troy and Sandra, thank you for that presentation. My first question I'd like to start out with, you had mentioned an RJS study. I'm not familiar. What is that? Back in the presentation, you had talked about doing an RJS.
Oh, ArcGIS, I'm sorry.
ArcGIS, okay.
ArcGIS. My accent probably slurred
Okay.
a little bit.
Yeah, that's all right. I just wanted to make clarification on that. Thank you. And then 2 quick questions. I see burrowing owls in the East Bay frequently. And do they have a management program? Have we talked to anyone from East Bay Mud or East Bay Parks and, shared information or gotten ideas from them?
Want me to start?
Sure.
I would say generally, yes, we've talked to, pretty much everybody in the Bay Area and even beyond within the state about, what they know about burrowing owls and how owls are behaving in their neck of the woods. We haven't formally reached out to them anytime recently to talk about what they're doing. The East Contra Costa County HCP and CCP covers burrowing owls, not in the same, they don't have a separate burrowing owl strategy like the habitat plan does, but they're sort of using the strategy of, buy lots of high quality habitat and hopefully everything will be okay. I think so far that's probably true. They aren't monitoring owls as intensively as we are there either. And then in other parts of, eastern Alameda County and places like that, there's no monitoring program going on like we have going on down here. So I think generally people would probably say, researchers would probably say that owls are possibly doing okay. They're at lower densities in the Altamont Hills and places like that, but nobody really knows for sure. It's a little more sporadic than it is in the South Bay.
Okay, yeah, I was hiking along and there's 2 on a fence post and there's
They're
2
around
on a
for
hillside.
sure.
And it was
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
oh, so, and then, so with the amount of areas, we had those circles drawn around where the birds are, and they have a half-mile area around them. That's like between First Street and Zanker from, north of San Jose near Alviso. Those areas are definitely on the road to development. You see that coming
Right.
in the things that are going on in Alviso. There's plans there to make Alviso bigger. We see work at the water treatment facility. They're working on both sides of the road there.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of population, 10, 15 years down the road, given the development plan for that area? I mean, how many birds can be sustained there? Can we really invest in a population growth there when there's going to be less and less and less land for them? And then I appreciated that comment towards the end of the presentation, Sandra, where you said we're looking at other locations. Are we considering other locations to try to build these populations up?
Yeah, definitely. Again, maybe I'll take a shot, and then if you guys want to jump in.
I'll jump in after you.
The basic, I think, ultimately success, if we look down the road, success in this situation would look like not having, I might say this, and some people might balk at this, but not having any owls in the urban environment and having lots of owls down, in protected, wider open spaces down the valley. I mean, we could have some sustained populations in North San Jose, but it's not ideal because it's just not, relying on airports, for example, as your sort of source of owls is not great, because at any any given day, the airport could say, we're an airport, we don't want birds on the airport, and we've seen that. So it's a question, with the regional wastewater facility. The investment that we're making there now is, we have these short-term management agreements, so we're not locking that land up in perpetuity like we might in other parts of the reserve system. I think, right now there's about 200 acres up there. It'd be great if that area were bigger over time, and maybe that might be part of the solution as that area starts to develop. Who knows? But it's going to stress that population eventually. I mean, the birds that are there are certainly, I think relying, for foraging purposes, relying on all of that open land up there. And so as that disappears, it'll be a similar story to what we've seen in other parts of the South Bay where, as the foraging habitat dwindles down, you can't sustain as many nesting birds. So, in all of those places that we mentioned, except maybe the National Wildlife Refuge, which is going to be protected probably forever. I think there is a question mark about all of those. It's definitely not the best place to have a conservation area, and we would prefer them to be in places like Coyote Valley or up in the hills or wherever. So that's the long-term goal.
Thanks, Troy.
Yeah, it's kind of a holding strategy right now.
Right.
To try to sustain the population up there, to allow for us to catch up, to do the captive rearing, to have a genetically a population that this is their home. Right? You talk to the Canadians. One of the biggest things they're struggling is that the birds were extirpated from British Columbia, so it's really hard to reestablish a population of whatever animal in an area where they've been extirpated. So we're working with a population that is unique to some degree genetically, and this is what they call home, and trying to use that as the building blocks. And that's why Sandra's doing all this work, and her team, to look at open space areas across the country, across the county, what other sites could help sustain a future burrowing owl population out of that development zone. Hopefully there'll always be birds in North San Jose, because there is enough patchwork of acres to support birds. I think one of the big challenges for us is management of those lands. We don't have control over what goes on at the airport or Moffett. There's conflicting agendas both at Moffett and the airport safety being one of them. But this is, without these birds, we couldn't even do what we're talking about here. Yeah, it would be so it's important to do something there with the goal of recovering the species. I think the 200 number is crazy. I don't think we're ever going to have 200 birds, but hopefully we can get it to a point where there's more than 50.
Great, thank you. Other questions?
I just have two quick questions.
Really?
Just two quick questions. One was to do with Sergeant Ranch. That's a pretty big property. How'd you guys manage to locate this, and where on, because it would have been within the
Right.
Santa Clara County border.
Correct.
How'd you manage that?
When Howard Justice of DACA, Debt Acquisition Corporation of America, was trying to build rapport with everybody around here, maybe even met with your group, Julie, I don't know. But we took field trips out there, and he came into my office a couple times, asked us questions about this, that, the other thing. So I asked him, can we do burrowing owl surveys out there? And he said, sure. So that's kind of how we got on there. I don't know what'll happen there. Sandra, you didn't find any birds out there, right?
Wintering birds
Weren't
we
they?
have
Yeah.
every year.
But no breeding, right?
There have been, the rancher reported maybe have seen some near the corrals in the flat areas.
Yeah.
Okay.
Henshaw.
Yeah. The other thing is, and maybe I remember this wrong from past presentation on burrowing owls, but I thought the whole idea of translocating them to another area was really problematic. Do I remember that incorrectly?
Well, there's two types of translocation. So there's the actual taking birds, adult birds, from an area that's going to be developed and trying to move them to somewhere else.
So it's
And
because they're going to be fledgling that you think that there's much
hopefully,
more chance
I can
for...
let these two address it. but
Yeah, and
that's-
I would
that's-
say that the techniques have evolved over time. So there have been some stories from years past, maybe decades past now, where, people I think were just trying to move birds, I won't say haphazardly, but without much of a plan and without really testing what works and what doesn't work. And I think there probably in almost every case that was not successful. And then in places like Arizona and now in Canada and other places, I think we've learned, actually in Southern California too, they've done some of this, like the Army has done some of this, where the simple things like, and Sandra alluded to this in her presentation, but simple things like when if you have them over winter and then when you put them out in the spring, they pair up pretty readily. Actually, that's one thing that we learned is like, yeah, they don't care that much as long as there's a female and a male. They just whatever. So once they're paired up, you put them out there in the enclosure for a couple of weeks or whatever it is. And if you wait until like, for example, once they lay their first egg, they're committed to the site. You can remove the enclosure, and then they'll stay there. And years ago, that was just moving birds around. Wasn't that kind of systematic approach, and so I think that's probably the main thing. It's just that the scientific community has learned a better way to do it over time. So, yep.
Other questions?
Yeah, I had kind of several maybe quick questions. So the productivity number that we had, that 3.4 juveniles, that's fledged birds, I assume, per pair?
I think it's per. I don't know if it was on there. I think it was per female. Yeah. So
Female.
per.
But I guess my question just was more, is that sort of, in the ballpark of what we've seen in the past and what we see nationally?
Sandra, do you?
Say that again, I'm sorry, I was looking at the numbers.
Our productivity numbers that we've seen, I mean, I know they've changed, from
Yep.
last year to this year, but are they in the ballpark of what we've seen like 20 years ago in, maybe some smaller number of sites or nationally? That is, we haven't seen we're not seeing inbreeding depression reflected in productivity, or are we?
So as Troy was mentioning, this population, or maybe it was Ed, is somewhat genetically isolated. And so we definitely do see some of the inbreeding, which is problematic. The migrant populations seem to be much more mixed and genetically diverse, and they probably have fewer problems because of that. Overall, there's a declining trend everywhere. Imperial Valley was always one stronghold that's doing so-so, I think. But overall, I would say there's a decline.
Yeah.
But the productivity number, that's really what I'm kind of.
Yeah, the productivity number, I think, for around here, it's about what we've seen historically, but it's not good, I would say. And I think we've always known, and Phil Higgins has done some work over the years, looking at like diet, what are birds eating during the nesting season, and is it like a high nutrition diet or a low nutrition diet, comparatively. And I think now we see, for example, if we feed the birds and it's a little bit anecdotal, from this year, last couple of years, but if we feed the birds a high quality diet like mice during the nesting season, it has a pretty dramatic effect on the number of young that they produce. So, in those situations, you can sort of like back calculate and think like, well, yeah, then maybe it is the forage quality is not quite high enough for them to actually produce, that high number. And then if you kind of take it to the extreme, when we were up in British Columbia, the birds are in captivity, so it's a completely controlled situation. Those birds were, they were laying like 7 or 8 eggs.
Up to 12, yeah.
Up to 12 eggs.
That's normal.
And they had a 100% success rate because they're getting 2 mice a day, right? And so you can see that there's potential for that. So 3 young versus 10 is a pretty big difference, and it has to do with a number of things. Diet, during the nesting season, and like last year, we had after a lot of the birds had initiated their nest, there was a lot of flooding at the regional wastewater facility and at Don Edwards. So a lot of those first nesting attempts got flooded out last year, and then the second nesting attempts occurred, but they're always a little bit, they're not as good. And so there's, year to year, there can be things like that that affect the productivity, the average productivity. But I think we're hoping, we think the productivity could be better, and that's why the supplemental feeding is important.
So there's some promise in kind of just increasing the productivity.
Yes. Yeah, we think so.
So I did notice that, like, I think you did feeding in 3 breeding areas, but specifically not Warm Springs. Is that because we were just treating Warm Springs as kind of a control, or why was there no feeding like there? Which, I think I heard historically had, larger population of burrowing owls.
Part of it was as a control site, part of it is also just access and having people out there to feed and to keep cost at a good level. We already have people out there at Shoreline and Moffett anyways, and so they were feeding. For Don Edwards, it would be an additional trip to actually feed the birds there. So yeah, twofold. Definitely a control site as well.
And the last question I had is, I think every time we do this, I ask about Sunnyvale Baylands, because I used to work there. So I used to see owls all the time there until the grass went crazy, and there was no management of it. And so and then I noticed that actually, I think you did say that there was maybe a pair, and I think
Last year there was one pair successfully raising young. This year Deborah only saw sign like whitewash, but no birds or young.
So my question is, why aren't we trying to get some kind of management agreement there? Is that site just too small, given the development of the foraging areas? Or because historically, just that small site, there used to be a lot of owls in the whole area.
Yeah.
But that specific site always had 2 pairs for many, many, many years, along with a pair on a 237 exit ramp. So, and they were there for many, many, many years, even just in that small area.
Yeah, I can't recall, have we talked, I know we haven't talked to Sunnyvale.
No.
I think maybe Phil has or something, but anyway. Yeah, well, we can definitely think about that. I think we just haven't approached them.
Yeah, so we talked to Palo Alto, and they were eager, but the landfill regulators are not eager to have ground squirrels on the landfill.
But Sunnyvale,
It's usually, there's usually some sort of obstacle, to be blunt, but I haven't talked to them.
Yeah.
the Sunnyvale Baylands, it's easily accessible. And at least several years ago, there were park staff from Sunnyvale that were excited about the possibility.
Yeah.
So I think it'd be well worth it, as long as you guys thought that it was, showed some kind of promise.
So it's not a landfill
small.
then?
No,
Okay.
this is right off 237, so it's near the
237, okay.
mitigation ponds.
All those mitigation ponds?
Yeah, so it's, just in towards town
Are
from the
those, is that
mitigation
near,
ponds.
where Steel Wave was, or where all that development
There's
happened?
Sunnyvale BPCP, right? And then there was the landfill, and right next to us there's the Baylands Park.
Yeah, so it's not under any threat of development.
Right.
It's
Right.
probably a site of 20 acres
Okay.
or so between the kind of salt pond area, the pollution control plant in 237.
Yeah,
So
I think
it's
it's
north of 237.
I think it's worth exploring. We're definitely always looking for ways to build in repetition, right? Because we don't have too many sites.
Yeah.
And so if it's worth taking a look at, and then, we can get in contact with them and see if they're interested in some sort of an agreement. That might be worthwhile.
Yeah, I would
Yeah, for sure.
really encourage that, if
Sure.
you thought the
Yeah,
site
yeah,
was
yeah.
big enough.
Yeah. Well, and even so, it's, it's a stepping stone, up the peninsula. So.
Moffett.
Yep.
Not too far from
Right.
the other locations.
Right.
And it's, like I said, there were owls regularly, really until they just stopped, until the grass started growing
Right.
tall, and then the owls disappeared.
Right.
But-
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Other questions?
A couple here. Are you doing any monitoring at all of private lands? Have you attempted to?
On
Private, and we've been out to Kyle's Ranch, private,
Okay.
but it's just getting permission. There's been some surveys done, car surveys by Sandra and by ICF, and they've seen some birds in the Pajaro River corridor. But
That's
it's,
not a focus.
it's getting permission to go on private land.
Right.
But when it's granted, like with Kyle or with the Sargent Ranch people, we go out there. And the wildlands, that's private too, and we went out there.
Okay.
yeah.
Because I know some folks that might
Okay.
be available to do that. that might-
Okay, yeah,
might be.
that'd be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, there hasn't been a systematic effort to, locate and contact people. It's more been opportunistic.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You said that you only were able to monitor certain areas every other year or every third year. Lack of staff. Have you ever considered training volunteers to do that? I mean, there's a lot of people that would love to go out and count owls.
Yeah, we haven't, except for you. There's one. We haven't thought about a volunteer program. That's something we probably could do. It's mostly, actually, frankly, have the funding and the staff to do that if we wanted to. If we wanted to do a much larger survey area every year, we could. We're always keeping our eye on the sort of long-term sustainability of the funding source and just making sure that we're balancing, monitoring, feeling good about, are we missing anything? It kind of gets to a point of diminishing returns. You can go out and survey, as much as you possibly can and maybe not find any more owls. And so we always try to balance, are we feeling pretty good about our monitoring effort and that we're not missing anything, and then making sure that we have enough funds to do all the other things that we talked about. So, and a lot of it has to do with habitat condition as well, too. So, we might go out to a site or you might actually be able to just drive by a site in a given year, in March, and like the grass is 3 feet tall, and you're like, yeah, there's probably no owls there. So it's a lot of that too. So.
Well,
Yeah, and
if there's a
yeah,
shortage of people, it sure seems like a.
yeah, I've been directing them to cut back on the surveys because we're in tier 3 now. Either we save the birds or they're going to go extirpated from the. So I'm not in favor of doing more surveys, volunteers, regardless. So I'll take the heat for that. But
So,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
so it's just focusing on
Yeah,
trying to
I mean,
rehab
Sandra,
the
if you
ones
want
you
to
got.
pull up the slide that shows where the birds were in 14 and where we are now. So,
Well, yeah, I remember that,
yeah.
This one? Which one?
The one that shows the numbers.
Oh, the numbers.
Yeah,
Sorry,
that's okay.
this one.
Yeah.
And I would like to say, I think sites with a lot of potential we have surveyed every year, but those sites where, there are no ground squirrels anymore, vegetation is always tall, and the likelihood that we find birds there is just so small that it's not really worth it. But those sites that do look good and where we have had recent observations, we do go back to.
I should have made a point, I was talking about wintering birds, not the breeding birds.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh, that's different. Yeah.
yeah. that-
Okay.
I didn't make that clear.
Okay.
So, anyway.
Okay.
The Canada birds, have they gotten any data? I mean, we know one of them came down here. We don't know where it went after it left here. But do they have any other data or where those Canada birds are going? You said they're not getting a lot of results, but do they have any results?
They do have some returns, and they have done some radio tracking, and the birds go every which way. There's no defined path. Do you remember exactly what?
I don't remember numbers, but I have a map that we could have included in the presentation that I can send to Ed and he can distribute. That's pretty interesting, where they show where they've had band recoveries, basically people who've resighted banded birds that they started. And it is pretty interesting. I mean, they are literally, sort of like populating the western U.S. with birds. So we can get you that map if you're interested in it. It's a pretty good graphic that just shows where their birds are going.
I'd love to see that,
Yeah.
One of the problem for the Canadian birds is the lack of natural burrows.
Yeah.
They don't have a prairie dog or ground squirrel population. They relied a lot on badger holes, and the badgers are way down in British Columbia. So there isn't the I'll use a fish term, there isn't the substrate for, there isn't the quality habitat burrow densities. So they put in a lot of artificial burrows, right? Isn't that correct?
800 burrows they have dug by hand.
Wow.
And they maintain, I think she said 500. They go to 500 burrows every year and make sure they are still in good condition. Yeah, those are strong people.
Yes. So it's endangered, right? Animal in Canada. So the Canadian government's pouring a lot of money into trying to turn it around. And it's not just in British Columbia that they're doing this. The U.S., it's not even a listed bird. Certain states it might be listed. It's a candidate species in California. So there isn't that effort into it. So we're getting some money from the state. The fees that are paid by developers are funding what we're doing. But the Canadian government's throwing a lot of money at this. And I guess the Pacific Northwest is benefiting from this investment. Washington, Oregon, Idaho. So, yeah.
And last, just a quick anecdote that's kind of related to it, but I volunteer at the WERC, Wildlife Education and Rehabilitation Center here in Morgan Hill, and we got 2 burrowing owls in the last few months. One of them, they were both injured. One of them, we recovered it, took it up to Shoreline, and Phil, and we set up one of those cages for 2 weeks. And on the 14th morning, it had been doing well, and it came out, it was dead on the 14th morning, the day we were going to release it. So just an anecdote that we almost had a successful owl that didn't quite.
It would have been great,
yeah.
It would have been great.
We currently have a burrowing owl that has a broken wing and cannot be released. And they were both found here in Morgan Hill, right off Monterey Road. So Phil knows about them. I don't know if you know about them, but I've reported them to Phil. So just an anecdote that they are still here. We run into them and people hit them on the roads, unfortunately. So just an anecdote.
Thank you.
Yeah, the first one likely had a head injury, potentially, and it was not held very long, and then unfortunately it didn't make it.
Yeah. That's all.
Any other questions? Questions from the general public? Any comments? All right.
Okay, we've been here a long time, so I'll be real brief on my EO report. So the advocacy update, we had 2 state legislator field visits on the 10th and 17th of September. You can see who attended. Senator Bell and Assembly members Stone and Clara attended in person. Senator Wykowski was going to attend in person, as was Senator Moaning, but fortunately at the last minute they had to cancel. But you get a sense of, we visited the plant area and just talked about Coyote Valley, talked about South County things that we're doing. We went to some existing open space areas and areas we would like to protect. And it was to promote the NCCP program and how important Prop 68 was for funding of NCCPs, among other things. The grant update on the next page. Some good news. We finally we did an agreement. Julie was involved in advocating for this, along with Kit and other people who are part of that big, large group.
By the IMC.
Thank you. So finally we got there. So secured up to $8 million in D7 funding for land acquisitions. We are also awarded a $500,000 grant from the Water District through their D3 program for Pacheco Creek stream restoration. So these restoration projects are very expensive. So the fact if we're getting a grant from the Water District, and we also applied for Prop 68 money, and we stand a good chance of getting funding from that. So potentially a half to 2/3 of the funding for that Pacheco Creek project could be funded by grants. So not just money that project proponents pay in fees would help with that. Land acquisition update. Calero's still happening. I think we made some headway with some meetings with county parks recently. It's been a journey.
We've been seeing this one here.
Yeah, the other journey is UTC Shingle Valley. We're really close on a donation agreement with the United Technology Corporation, and that would be for another 1,500 acres of their area that was not used for their missile fuel production. Even though the regional wastewater facility buffer lands are, I am concerned about the carrying capacity and for the species up there. We are talking to the facility about putting a conservation easement over the 200 acres up there. Some of it would be enrolled as an offset for some of the fees they would have to pay, and some of it would be enrolled independent of that. We're also, I can't get into details, but we are in various stages of discussions with landowners about their properties. None of them have burrowing owls on them, unfortunately. But one of them, OSA is taking the lead on, and then the other 5 we're taking the lead on. But we'd be the major funder for the OSA property if it happens. San Felipe grant, park restoration, you heard a little bit about it, but I just got some numbers here of what the credits are. And I mentioned that maybe we could do a future presentation. It sounds like that field trip would be the right way to do that. We could have the PAC meeting, maybe the one in May that we'd have out in the field, and we could do a field trip with you of the project area. And then, so as you can see, it's 1.82 miles of stream restored. You see the acres for restoration and creation. I didn't break it out for a perennial and seasonal. The perennial was only around 0.2 of an acre, so most of that is seasonal wetland restoration. And then the willow riparian, it's a relatively dry site, so it's going to be, that number may increase over time, but right now we're predicting 1.64 acres. Coyote Ponds, we're in so the construction's complete, we just got to do the plantings. So Coyote Ponds, we're in the permit phase with construction to begin next spring or early summer. Those are 2 ponds that have failed up on Coyote Ridge. And there is breeding CTS and red-legged frog in neighboring ponds within dispersal distance. So these would be important in sort of the meta population and trying to recover the species up there and create more resilience in the landscape. Pacheco Creek, we're going to begin the planning stages, and RFP is going to go out to hire a design consultant. And it would be on the property we own, which is 0.3 of a mile, and we are talking with a neighbor about acquiring additional acreage just to the east of that property. So it could be up to 3 miles of stream corridor if we're successful in acquiring that property, that we could focus on a major restoration project. They would benefit tricolored black warbird, which are in that area, because there's 2 large ponds, one on our property and one on this neighboring property, as well as create habitat for least Bell's vireo and benefit steelhead, because steelhead run in that creek, and also do a sycamore alluvial restoration. Coyote Creek, we're just in the feasibility phases of that, working with the city of San Jose and the water district. They got a big grant from the water district for invasive plant removal, and there might be an opportunity to kind of partner with them to do restoration in conjunction with their invasive plant. In the city of, the city of San Jose, so along the whole reach. Now, there won't be restoration opportunities along that, but there's the grant is to look at removing invasives along, I guess, from around Tulare Hill all the way up to, the Alviso area, yeah, wherever that creek kind of ends up. So it would be quite a major undertaking. We would just focus on habitat restoration, and it's really important for the regional board. They don't want us to ignore the urban areas, so it has some it benefits by working collaboratively with them. And there is it's an important environmental corridor for wildlife, fish and birds in particular. Okay, that is it. Thank you. And
Thank you
thanks
very
for
much.
sticking through this.
Yeah.
It's a
It was
long
an
meeting.
interesting
Yeah.
evening. All right, so there's any unfinished business? None? Okay. Any new business? Anything anyone would like to see on next meeting's agenda? No? Okay.
I'm still going to work on getting the water district to talk about Pacheco. I know one of you asked to have them come here and speak about Pacheco Dam. So,
All right. Well, thank you very much, committee. I appreciate your time. Meeting adjourned.